Okay, good morning and welcome back to this beautiful Baru Centre in Cashel at the foot of the rock with some magnificent history. So we're delighted to be here and to thank the team here for hosting us and doing it so well each year. I hope you get time to visit the beautiful museum here and to have a look around the rock today. It's my great pleasure now to welcome a dear colleague of mine who I've worked with for a number of years and came to know very well, even though our conversations now are over trolleys in the supermarket as we say hello to one another and complain about the shopping and the family. But I would like to welcome Phil Prendergast, a midwife of some renown and who has worked in this area for many years. And I remember working with a midwife, not Phil, some years ago, and she would say, when she would meet some of the mothers down the town, "That's my baby, and that's my baby, and that's my baby." And I'm sure Phil would have many stories of that type too. But one of the greatest things about her is her heart and how she opens her heart to people, understands and can walk in their footsteps and be with them in times of great difficulty and empathy. And over her years as an MEP and senator and regional councillor, we're delighted to have her represent us here today and to do the formal welcome for St. Patrick's Conference for the 9th time. So welcome, Phil Prendergast, please.
Thank you, Mary. That was a lovely, warm introduction, and I hope I can live up to it in giving some sort of a sense to my journey, which is quite diverse. But you are all very welcome to this beautiful venue. And I was just reminded that back in 2003, when I was first elected as Mayor of Clonmel, it was suggested that I should perhaps have a mayoral reception for the local branch of the ICA. And I thought, okay, that's great. So I wrote to the chairperson and invited them. And these, oh my goodness, the most amazing women appeared in the town hall, and we had a reception, and the diversity of these women was astonishing. They were interested in cooking and baking and hiking and walking and talking and knitting and sewing. And at the end of the evening and over the refreshments, they discussed how the scones had been made with a light hand, which apparently is a good thing. I didn't know too much about it. But we did really have a fabulous evening, and they suggested I should make out a rota about what I wore to what venue so that I didn't get boring on the paper. So when I was subsequently elected to the County Council, I was appointed Chair of the Strategic Policy Committee on Housing and Social Policy. And I was also then a de facto member of the Homeless Forum, which is so current now as it was then, but appears much worse. And I remember discussing how a lot of the money in the council was going to to do renovations and making houses suitable for older people, adapting grants to allow for showers to become wet rooms and to facilitate. And I said, why don't we just, as a policy, have a council plan that houses are future-proofed at the building time and not at great cost subsequently. And because when you move on and out of those areas, you're not aware, and I'm still not aware whether that ever became a runner. But when I was elected to the Senate, I was appointed by my party as spokesperson for older people. And I set up a forum, and we invited in Age Action and the Older and Bolder. And when I went to meet the Older and Bolder group, which I thought was a fantastic name, and I was basking the warm memories of my lovely meeting with the ICA, and they went through me like a dose of salts. I was under no illusion when I was finished that as policymakers, we weren't doing a great job, and as long-term policymakers, we had failed on many levels, but it wasn't just exclusively to my party, it was all of us. And I thought back to the 40 or so women I had in the town hall in Clonmellon that night, and I said, if only those 40 women were managing this country, we would be okay, because we'd have the sense. I was reading a little bit. I subsequently met some of those ladies when I was an MEP, and it was a great reunion out in Strasbourg, which was a nice little light event in the middle of a heavy week. I was reading recently that we are born copies, but we die as originals, and the most deadening myth is to caricature later life almost exclusively in terms of a miserable trajectory of decline and disease. Of course, bad things happen as we age, but people also grow and develop in later life. I'm looking forward to working and listening to people today. I'm very honoured to now work with older people, and I have to say I see compassion in action every single day, where the system supports compassion and doesn't stifle it. I would like to formally consider this conference open, and thank you.
Good morning, everyone. How are you? My name is Sarah Kagan. I am not Professor Whelan, and I'm going to be with you the entire day, rather like a bad penny, I say. Mary has an incredible, you'll notice that Mary Prendergast needs no introduction to any of us. She is an incredible power and an incredible leader in shaping, I think, all of our ideas and our community around compassion in our daily lives and in health and social care. And certainly she's drawn two people, me and our next speaker, Dana Walrath, from across the Atlantic, to engage with you. And it's really my honor to be able then to foster our conversation, to foster our greater sense of community together. And Phil, I'm incredibly impressed to meet you. And one of the things I have to comment upon is that I'm not surprised at all that you are a midwife by background and that you are now working with older people. Many people say to me, midwifery and older people, they don't really go together. In American nursing, we separate the two at the graduate level. And I say, no, in fact, I think they're really about the same sort of journey. And if we could only apply the philosophy of midwifery more often as we age, we'd all live in a healthier, warmer, and kinder society. So Phil, thanks for a wonderful start for today, because I would hope that we can take that warmth that you have personally conveyed and that you and Mary have articulated and consider what it is to live in an aging world, and how it is we all want to contribute to that aging world and make it a place where age is valued and respected as part of a life course that we're all privileged to enjoy. So with that, it is my honor to introduce a longtime friend of mine, Dana Walrath, and you'll notice that I know you all can read, so I'm not going to read the biographies to which you have access, but rather I'm going to try to give you a bit of personal insight for people I know well and for people like Phil, whom I've just met. So Dana and I last saw each other in Yerevan, Armenia, and last evening, Dana pointed out to me that Armenia and Ireland are opposite corners of the larger European community, going down to Portugal from Ireland and up to Estonia from Armenia. And if we think about how diverse, how wonderful, and how incredible just that small portion of our globe is, and how rapidly it's aging, you'll think about the idea that making a journey like that together, from Yerevan to Cashel, from wherever you hail, whether it's Cashel or some other place, here in Ireland or farther away, what is it to be here in space and time together to have an aesthetic appreciation? And I think that what you'll learn from Dana is that we should enhance and embrace the aesthetic experience of aging and compassion and balance that against what is too commonly only an intellectual, a cognitive conversation about what compassion is as we age. So Dana, thank you for being here, and I am going to put your slides up. Oop, nope, that won't do. There we are.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, good morning. What a pleasure and an honor it is to be here at the Cashel conference. Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction, to Phil, to Mary, to inviting me. We share that fascination with the boundaries of life. My dissertation was on childbirth, and now here I am working at the end of life. And I think it is that fascination with boundaries because I believe we need to cross those boundaries. Right now, we're living in a time of such global disarray, and the way through to making this a better world is for us to get rid of those boundaries that divide us from one another and find always what we have in common. Now, we have a shared mission here, putting compassion essential to healthcare, and we are all seeing spirituality as central to that mission. My emphasis, though, is on stories. So this morning, I'm going to invite you to sit back and enjoy stories that I'm going to tell you about dementia. Now, enjoy and dementia, I mean, that sounds like it's an oxymoron, or maybe it's a lie, but I promise you it's neither. Right now, I am living through the end stages of dementia with my mother, so I know all about how hard it can be, and I also know every time I forget something, I start worrying, uh-oh, it's already happening in me. I arrived here a day early, and that is in part because of the stresses of life, not because of early onset dementia, of that I'm sure. But I also know that by showing the opportunities that sickness brings, and by living this part of life differently, that we can support those with dementia, we can support caregivers, and we can rewrite the dominant narrative about aging. Now, how did I come to rethink the negative stories that we tell about this particular sickness? Well, I let my mother, Alice, and dementia move in with me. So 10 winters ago, Alice was running out of options, so she moved hundreds of miles north from around New York City, her lifelong home, to live with us in the Vermont woods. She hated snow. I was the daughter who got on her nerves, and the feeling was mutual. Now, you might wonder what made me think it was a good idea to have my mother and dementia move in with me just as my nest was about to empty. I mean, it wasn't like I had a lot of free time on my hands. In fact, I was a bitter medical anthropologist when my mother moved in. I was the exhausted professor responsible for putting culture, diversity, death, dying, teamwork, humanism, professionalism, all the easy, soft stuff into the curriculum of the medical school. So the last thing I needed was another hard job. Did that go? Oh, learning this. What have I done? Oh, I went the wrong way. I'm sorry. Where do I point it? Oh, you know what? I'll just do it this way. Okay, so the last thing I needed was another hard job. Now, for the first several months, I balanced my teaching work, the home care agency, and everything at home. But when Alice stood in my kitchen, admiring the cabinet knobs I had hand-painted, and she said, "You should quit your job and make art full-time," her loss was my gain. Alzheimer's. Now, I assure you, she never would have said anything so blunt and liberating to me before she got sick. It was more like, "Dana, you'll never get a job doing that. You should go to medical school." But I followed Alice's updated advice. I took a leave of absence from the university. I started making comics, and now I'm here. So that's my story. We think through story, we remember through story, we connect through story, but most of all, we heal through story. Stories lead us to find ways to deal with the pain as characters manage to accomplish what seems unimaginable in our own lives. And this isn't something that I learned in my training or from a book. It's something I learned from my mother one May morning as she stood by my dining room windows looking out over the rolling fields. And she sang this bit from Babes in Arms. And if you are big on Broadway musicals and you know this one, please join me. It goes, "It seems we stood and talked like this before. We looked at each other in the same way then, but I can't remember where or when. The clothes you are wearing are the clothes you wore. The smile you were smiling then, but I can't remember where or when." And then she stopped and she smiled and she said, "That should be the Alzheimer's theme song." So Alice set the tone. So when she said to me, "Dana, I just got my period. It's the first time, you know," I could say, "That's so nice. You're growing up. I'd always wanted a daughter." Alice blushed. It was a young day, a cold one, around 1944. Alice felt 11, and I hoped there wouldn't be a puddle when we got out of the car in 2009. And when she said to me, "Dana, why are you so good to me?" I knew how to answer. I was standing behind her at her dressing table, brushing her hair, and our eyes met in the center of the 3-part mirror that had stood on her dressing table for as long as I could remember. "Because you're my mother." Big, pregnant pause. "I'm your mother?" Alice turned to face me. "Who's your daddy?" "You were married to Dave. You had 3 children. Mark's the oldest, then me. Susie's the youngest." "Ah, yes, I remember." Alice turned back, and I kept brushing, watching her through the mirror. She looked up, and she found my eyes in the reflection. "I wasn't very good to you. I'm sorry." Unfinished business. I now know that that's the reason that she was there living with us, but I never imagined I would hear those words stated so simply. "Thanks." "So you forgive me?" "Of course." "How come?" "Because you did the best you could." Now, I knew that if I wanted it, Alzheimer's would let us have this conversation every single day. But forgiveness is also action that lets us redo the past. I wanted to stand at the same dressing table and brush her hair without yanking, without getting annoyed at her knots and chopping all her hair off. I wanted to listen to her as she spoke about her day. I wanted to guide her through uncharted territory, and I wanted to face sickness of the mental sort straight on instead of sweeping it under the rug. The rhythm of the brush soothed us both. When I set the brush down on the dressing table next to the bowl, overflowing with the strands of beads that Alice loved to wear, she turned to face me again and said, "Running a hotel must be very hard, Alzheimer's." So, memory loss gave us new ways to meet, to learn each other's stories, to write new ones, and to heal. And this is the story that I have to tell. It's not the usual dominant biomedical story. You know the one. It's dementia as a zombie story, bodies living without minds whose loved ones struggle with heartbreaking loss as they wait for the valiant researchers to find the cure. And of course there's loss. But stories let us reframe dementia as a diversity issue, as a window into another reality, where people living in that state can be our teachers, useful, true humans who contribute to our collective good instead of scary zombies. Now, I found the voice for our story the day I cut up a cheap paperback copy of Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, so maybe you could see Dormouse Queen and so forth in her clothing. That was her favorite garment. When she lived with us, most days included this exchange: "Time to get up, time to get dressed. Oh, no, I'm very comfortable," Alice always said. Now, it was only after drawing this picture in its entirety that I realized that the halos that had spontaneously appeared around Alice's head were reminiscent of Armenian manuscripts. So it was a subconscious reference to her first language, to her reversion to childhood, and to her altered magical state. Now, reverting to childhood can sound scary to some. It's dependency. I mean, it's depends. I think you have depends over here, right? Yes, it's depends. But think of the very, very best pieces of childhood. Its openness, its humility, its activity, its capacity for joy and connection, its stories. Those are the things that so many adults have lost track of, but the wisdom of aging can let us embrace, and we have teachers in our midst, those with dementia, to help us find that. Now, cartoonist and author-illustrator Mo Willems has said, never start a visual story on page 1 because it takes time to find the voice. So I began this on page 8 of a Moleskine sketchbook, and I knew I had found the voice, and I went back to page 1 and filled the book with 25 annotated drawings as part of the Brooklyn Art Library's sketchbook project. And I had made these drawings in the month after that Alice had moved out of our home and into memory care. And I want to take you through that visual story. It's a mere 324 words, a single typewritten page, and it's a story that you can find on the left-hand side of the page of my book, Alzheimer's. So it starts, Alice. Alice is disappearing, soon there will be none. Days with Alice. 77 years times 365 days equals 28,105 plus 21 since her birthday. Days without Alice. Of course, I wasn't there for all of those days, but I was here on December 2nd, 2010, making 28,126 marks in her honor. She isn't losing tangible parts, though she is disappearing. She didn't take off, though she has special powers. She's still here. She's just losing her memory, the part that kept her grounded, Alzheimer's. The night that broccoli grew out of Alice's ears, she saw endless possibilities. Broccoli's good, but apples are better. There's Dave in a tree. Cool. Dave died 4 years ago. Alice sees him when she looks up. Pirates help Alice. I'm starving. Those lousy pirates kept me on that island for an entire week without feeding me anything. Got any ice cream? So does the dog. Dana, Herbie ate my lunch. Do you have any ice cream? Their symbiosis developed into friendship. Alice had never liked dogs before. Alice and her sister sublimated their sibling rivalry into their respective preferences for cats and dogs. Alice feels bad about herself sometimes. Sunsets are scary. It's World War II. Japanese soldiers surround the house, or worse. Theoretical physics helps Alice at sunset. Space, time, travel, one of her special powers, accounts for all she has seen, but it's always safe when she lands back at our house in 2010. I first met Alice in 1960. I don't remember the details. It's a girl child, neither does she. I'm your mother. Who's your daddy? Alice. I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have been changed several times since then. So yes, it's a love story, that first story. And it's visual for a very important reason, because when people are losing their verbal skills, they retain all their visual capacities. We are born with our eyes able to focus just that distance between our faces and whoever's holding us. So when people have lost words, they're still human, and we can still reach them, and pictures are a very important way of doing it. Now, this sketchbook project that I made these pictures for breaks all the rules of engaging with books and art, in that the sketchbooks gets checked out and paged through, and then they disappear eventually, and all that's left is a digital copy, a digital record of that person. It's so like life and death and letting go of someone. And as those originals disappeared, though, new layers emerged. So I began writing stories to accompany the images, and I posted these on a blog. And then I printed the images onto canvas, and I started embroidering the halos and slippers to honor my mother's love for mending. And as I was sewing, I realized that the back sides of the cloth had a tangle of threads, like the tangles and plaques of Alzheimer's disease. So I started making two-sided pieces of art, drawing around the tangles. And then as I started using an awl to poke through the canvas to save my fingertips, another layer appeared. My mother's father, Yeriche Mashoyan, a survivor of the Armenian genocide of 1915, had made his living in New York City as a shoemaker. He must have used an awl each day at work. Next, I switched back into sewing into paper, into images that were printed on paper, which was a metaphor for how our human connections are so delicate, and for how we have to keep on regrouping through sickness to find what works at that moment. This is the power of story, that kind of flexibility, that kind of metaphor. Now, why was I certain I wanted to use comics for this story? Well, it's not because comics are hot, though they certainly are, and it isn't because comics have made their way into the academy. Now there are peer-reviewed journals and conferences and dissertations and monographs all written in comics form, and they've even made their way into medicine. It isn't their commercial success right now with people of all ages. It's not their simplicity or their look. It's their depth. Graphic stories allow for complex, multi-layered, nonlinear storytelling. And that's just the kind of storytelling that we need for life and death and sickness and health and the losses and gains of dementia. And as I said, images are integral for someone who's losing their words. Comics in particular are fantastic for people with dementia who always loved a good book. When Alice lived with us, watching her eat up every graphic narrative that came into the house, from the Fun Home, to Mouse, to Persepolis, to the wordless robot Dreams. When I walked by as she was reading this, she said, "This is a very, 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 very good book." I mean, because she was empowered by being able to read again and follow a story as she turned the pages. I wanted to write in a form that someone with dementia could access, and that visual-verbal combination makes up for the memory loss, and it lets all the content stay sophisticated. And if I've learned one thing from this journey, it's that the loss of short-term memory and sophisticated thinking are very different things. And in fact, if you're watching it, the sophisticated thinking that someone with dementia uses is remarkable, and that it's our task to learn to follow them. I mean, I have these fantasies that memory care centers, every place, will start filling their libraries with comics to empower people to keep that part of themselves still going. Now, comics also have the advantage that subconsciously we associate them with laughter. And we all need permission to laugh at sickness instead of just describing it in medical terms. Laughter is respite. It opens up new possibilities for how to cope. Now, so please laugh at all of these. And if you believe, like Alice did, that science is the only way to understand sickness and health, then finding the good in an incurable sickness is pretty uncomfortable. I mean, what could be more taken for granted conventional truth than that we go to the doctors to be cured? Until dementia, this was Alice's truth, and like so much of the public across North America and across Europe, she believed that science is the key to doctors' special powers. And through science, medicine has had some amazing successes, but we anthropologists know that biomedicine is more than science. It's a system of beliefs and practices. Now, to get a sense of this, I want you to go back to your earliest memories. You aren't feeling well. What did you do? What did you do when you didn't feel well? You went to bed. Did you go to bed on your own? What'd you do? You checked in with whom? Usually your mom. What did she do? Yeah? She touched your forehead, took your temperature. Okay, we are raised in a rationalistic, scientific society where being sick is defined in terms of measurement, and the preferred sick role is temporary. So as children, we learn to seek out expert care, parents, doctors, who measure us in some way and see how sick we might really be. And we learn to locate sickness in our bodies. We had headaches or stomach aches or lung cancer, the way my father Dave had. I want you to try on this idea instead. This comes from medical anthropology. We locate sickness and health not just in the physical body. We locate it in three interrelated bodies: the physical, the social, and the political. So the physical we all know. The political is that largest overarching prevailing political economy that impacts the social distribution of sickness and health and the means available to help those who are sick. I mean, globally, we all know that wealth means health. Now, the social body, the yeses and nos in there, that determines the meanings and values surrounding particular states. It determines the ideal body and legitimizes all those social practices that we use to attain that body. Now think about things like Botox, facelifts, hair dye. These are all reflections of youth-oriented societies that don't appreciate the wisdom of aging and our collective fear of death, and how we're not ready to sort of face that and just let go and put it all into a cycle. The social body also determines the boundaries of the physical body. Now, biomedicine focuses on curing our individual physical bodies, and it's really good at getting in there and repairing injuries and surgeries and so forth. And though I've drawn a single body here, many societies don't locate sickness just inside of one body. It's located in families, and it's thought of that person's stomach hurts because those two people are fighting. And isn't that the truth so often? But we don't look at it that way in our society. And instead, we focus just on individuals. But as any caregiver knows, we live the sickness too. And while biomedicine can cure some sicknesses, it flounders with permanent hurts, troubles of the mind, states present from birth, or that are incurable, messy, or incapacitating, and eventually lead to death. These states are stigmatized and feared. Now, anthropologists, of course, we have a $12 term or a €12 term, £12 term for this, and it's called social death. So on this diagram, the squares refer to social birth and biological birth and biological death, and we all know those: emergence from the womb, or that last beat of the heart, or the final breath. But every society also defines when life begins and when it's taken away. Personhood, when we consider someone a human and when we don't. So when my Armenian ancestors brought food to the graves of their relatives for the first 40 days after their death, it was because social death hadn't yet taken place. Now, stigma, silence, and social death surround rejected ways of being, like dementia. And this rejection echoes throughout the hallways of hospitals and schools and grocery stores. Stories, on the other hand, rewrite this rejection. They bring back the humanity of a person with dementia. Now, Alice must have instinctively used this because she used stories every day. Pirates, the ultimate hostage takers, often lent her a hand. Now, these were pirates with a dash of Johnny Deppness or the crimson glow of the young Burt Lancaster, and Alice sang with them, and they laughed together on the ship or the island, and she always returned from the island or the ship famished but content. I liked these pirates. Now, laughter was the only course when Alice said to Peter, the father of my children, "You get into that bed right this second, because if I'm not pregnant by tomorrow morning, they'll kill us both." Laughter loosens us, and then we notice, perhaps subconsciously, that in a single image, conflicting realities can coexist: my dining room and my dog and the pirate ship. And this is just as it is for the daily lives of people living with dementia. And that seeing those two realities on the same page might make it easier for a caregiver to stop pushing back, to let the more benign hallucinations and misunderstandings of dementia just be a part of daily life. Now, stories let us break rules, whereas medicine is about rules and social control, following the rules, doctors' orders. Now, physicians, because that's their job, they have to talk about preventing wandering because it's not safe. Whereas in a story, I can talk about how I let Alice wander and I still let her wander with the dog because it preserved her dignity. Now, that story might give a frustrated caregiver a bit of respite or a laugh or a new idea. Stories can show us that hallucinations are not just something to be medicated away. They're a language that we can decipher. Like when my mother showed me that she needed to talk about something tough by saying, "Dinah, can you come here? I think I grew hooves and horns." And then she let me pull back the blanket and look at her hands and feet, and I counted all her fingertips and all her toes to show that they weren't horns. And my head, "Is it okay?" And I pet her head to show her that there were no horns there, and knew that what she was telling me is that she had something on her mind. So I asked her, "Is something bothering you? I wasn't very good. I'm sorry." And it opened the door. Our job is to learn to follow those hallucinations and know what they mean instead of medicating them away. Stories can show us that hallucinations are also speaking about yearning, the way my mother always saw my dead father in the branches of the maple trees surrounding our farmhouse. It was longing. Now, stories let us take biological death straight on, the way Alice did, and that can only lessen the suffering from social death. I mean, Alice practiced dying on a regular basis. She would say, "Get a shower curtain or something to put under me, would you?" In the middle of dementia, she knew that our bodies often let go when we take that last breath. Now, rehearsal usually happened around sunset, and I would sit with her and my dead father and her parents hovering in the air around us. And Alice took tiny steps toward them, and then back to me. It was our own lobster quadrille. She was truly in between, liminal, as in a rite of passage, transcending two worlds, though physiologically there were no signs that biological death was nigh. Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you join the dance? In the middle of Alzheimer's disease, Alice knew that we needed to practice because our medical system equates death with treatment failure. Doctors hand off the situation to another kind of expert, religious perhaps, or secular, the funeral home director. Now, when death is feared and mind problems stigmatized, Alzheimer's brings on social death. And I knew that when Alice left our home for the lockdown unit, that we'd be hastening this death. Would not, could not, would not join the dance. But when the time came for Alice to move, the transition was okay because we had rehearsed. A few nights before Alice moved, she gave me a story to explain the transition to others. I just tucked her into bed for the night, and I went back down the hall to my room, and I heard her calling me, "Lady, lady, lady!" And I ran back down the hall and opened the door, and I said, "What's up?" I just wanted to know your name. Dana. Pretty name, thanks. You gave it to me. And you mean if I just call, you'll come? It might not be me, but I promise you if you call, someone nice will come. Oh, that's good. Thank you. I'll sleep well knowing that. Will you? Won't you? Will you? Won't you? Won't you join the dance? Alzheimer's. Dementia gave us a gift. It let us recognize each other's intentions and actions and cores. And these stories show us that people retain their libido, their intelligence, their humor, their social graces, and their compassion long after the fragmentation of their autobiography. And I know we can't always laugh, but they're always gifts. And they're ways to grow and stories to tell. Now, the biggest gift that Alice gave me happened that first spring when she lived with us. We were driving along that same country road that we took to get everywhere. And Alice said, "Where are we? How did I get here? You're in Vermont. You moved in with us a while ago because you have Alzheimer's disease and it isn't safe for you to live alone. You live here? It's pretty." Big stands of lilac in full bloom lined the road, and cows and fresh young calves chomped the grass down to tufts behind fenced fields, hay ripened in others. Alice put her hand on my shoulder and she said, "Promise me you'll do something different when it gets too hard." And I promised, not knowing how I would ever recognize the moment. But Alice made it easy on me. Fall 2010. She no longer had the language capacity to express what she knew, so she used action. She hit Peter, the biggest competition for my attention, with a broom, and she threw things at him. She took the insides out of her diapers, her nappies, and left them in my studio. It wasn't meanness. She was simply telling me that it was time for something else. And when I explained to her that she'd be going to a school, especially for people with dementia, that was down in New York near my brother and her sister, aka memory care, those behaviors completely evaporated. And Alice said, "Oh, good, I love school." Alzheimer's. So through dementia, I got to know Alice as a schoolgirl at Armenian School in New York City, realizing she was getting developmentally younger by the day. I could imagine that someday she might speak only Armenian, her first language, as she did sometimes when she woke up from a nap. So I had to find a solution, and I headed to Armenia, Alice's ancestral homeland, and there I met Sarah, and now I'm here, so there's another lineage. I went there to make comics about growing old in that ancient culture, but I went in search of lost memories, memories of the grandparents I never knew. Now, in Armenia, people often referred to my genetic memory as though I had a series of latent codons that could be expressed only in the homeland. And what they called my genetic memory helped me learn dance steps, it accounted for my spiritual bent, and it helped me speak Armenian. But in Armenia, I suddenly had countless grandmothers and grandfathers. And when the elders I worked with learned of my mother's dementia, their first response was always the question, was she a genocide survivor? As though only trauma and its denial could create memory loss. Now, during Alzheimer's disease, as Alice became a little girl again, I saw her relive the shame she felt as a dark immigrant kid in New York City sent from her railroad walk-up apartment to Central Park to gather plantains for her mother's wounds. Now, my mother, who was often sad, we'd now describe it as clinical depression, she used to send me outside with a weeding tool to remove the plantains sprouting up from our lawn. But in Armenia, I met Greta. And when she told me of the countless herbs and their medicinal properties and the other remedies passed down through the generations, Alice and Greta were meeting too, and it was healing for all of us. Healing is not the same as curing a disease. It doesn't involve surgery or taking a pill. It doesn't happen inside of one person's body. Healing depends upon sharing stories with others so our collective memories can meet. By meeting through story, we make peace and move on, even if we're sick or if we're hurt or if we're dying. Now, it's a good thing I ran into you in the parking lot, Alice often said to me. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't. Alice was relieved to be living with us. She just wasn't sure who we were. Recognition, it's that public's threshold. It's the first thing people still ask me today when they learn that my mother's still alive. Does she recognize you? This is just identity. This is the public side of self. Daughter, mother, anthropologist, artist, wife. Each of these prescribes a set of social behaviors that go with the role. What I've learned through my mother's illness is that it's not that social role and the recognition of me as an individual, of any of us as individuals, that matters. It's the recognition of intention and behavior. And people with dementia are outstanding at recognizing intention and behavior. So if you approach them with an open heart, there's no anger. If you approach them ready to listen with compassion, they relax immediately. From Armenia, Alice and I stayed in touch by Skype. Erica from Memory Care would set her up so she could type while we chatted. It was 10 p.m. New York, Yerevan time, and 2 p.m. New York time. And from the windows of my apartment, I looked out to this giant statue of Mother Armenia. She had a sword like this, and there was a Ferris wheel right at her right flank. It was the perfect image to accompany dementia. And we would sing together, or I would sing and she would listen and she would type, and we'd go back and forth, English to Armenian and back again. Me singing a song that I had sang to my own children. It goes like this: Sirdu ho kisyaro jan kezi hetgu kam. With my heart and soul, dearest, I come with you. Alice typing, heart, heart, me typing while singing. I like all these hearts. Alice typing, heart and soul. Sirdu ho Kis Yarojan, dear John, Anushas, you are sweet. I keep these words from Alice in case I ever need help remembering Alzheimer's. So through dementia, Alice taught me to laugh at sorrow, to slow down, to enjoy a cup of tea, to recognize the repetition of dementia as a form of prayer. As she said, every 2 minutes or so, oh, this tea, it's delicious. Thank you. During this journey, Alice often said to me, you know, you must have been a cute little kid. I wish I had known you then. And I always answered, you too, knowing all along that I've had the ultimate privilege of space-time travel, of knowing my mother as a young woman, as a schoolgirl, as a kid, and now as a very young child. I dream that stories will become integral to health encounters, that diagnosis will be accompanied by support for people to find, for families to find all those hidden gifts, to help families find the magic, to rehearse, to let go of our egos and all of our old social roles. And in doing so, we get to tell our stories and show the faces and the daily reality of those with dementia and other different ways of being. And in the process, we remove the stigma and we restore humanity. Comics, stories, they let us see the world through the eyes of others, those who are hurting, to feel their stories, to remember our own, and to heal, and to fly over the world, as Alice does. Thank you. And I've left time for questions. Just
If you have questions, and then of course at the end, before we break for lunch, we will have time for a plenary discussion that I imagine will be incredibly rich.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah, 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 and not the usual approach, too. So, yeah.
The memory centre that she's in now, do you find that they are very open to new ways of thinking?
Oh, that's such a great question. Memory care centers in the US are a terrible, profitable business. So, what happens is when you get too difficult, they kick you out of the memory care center. So, my mother was kicked out in 2014. And I got a phone call, 30 days, you've got to find a nursing home for her. That's all she's good for. She had begun, starting in about February of that year, tapping like this all the time. So they isolated her more and more, and all she did was get more and more agitated. I was thinking it was the disease, and as it turns out, she was protesting that this wasn't right. And when they kicked her out, I ended up bringing her back up to Vermont, to a completely, Vermont is an outside the box place for in the United States. It's Bernie Sanders country. Farm to table, aromatherapy, midwives, we're very down to earth there. And there was a place that had community living, not just for people with memory troubles. In fact, it was more for people with mental illness, developmental delays, disabilities, or adults who just needed a place to live and couldn't afford to maintain their own home anymore. And so these are mixed communities, and they had heard me speak about Alzheimer's, and they invited me to meet with them and just to see what they were doing. And maybe I would research or write about them. What ended up happening is when my mother got kicked out of memory care, I called them and I said, might you take her in? And they did. And since then, they've become brilliant at integrating people with dementia into their communities. And what happens is my mother started tapping less. Right away, she was part of a community again. And she could contribute in her own way. Her next door neighbor, I think, had schizophrenia, but she knew he was good to her, and they would watch TV together. And so every time she walked into the room, she would say to him, "You're good." And he heard this 5 to 8 times a day from my mother every time she saw him. And she helped him be in better condition. And then other people who had their complete memories and wits would help her with various things. And so she's been there, less medicated, without tapping, and now, for now, 3 years, and we're nearing the end of her life. But it was a fascinating journey. So memory care, on the other hand, sets up this kind of hierarchy so that the people who are just at the beginning of losing their memories see the other people who have really lost their memories, and they get freaked out and they want them out of sight and out of mind. So we need to destigmatize memory loss for memory care centers more than almost any place else. So yeah, you're welcome.
I just want to say this really feeds into the Irish psyche of storytelling. It feeds into the Irish psyche of storytelling, and also the mystical nature of how we would like to do things in healthcare, given the opportunity not to have all these regulations.
Yes.
And it really feeds into the soul of who we are. So thank you for giving us this opportunity to hear this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So the Armenia-Ireland connection. Thank you.
Sorry, there we go. I think we're all transported, and in a way, I'm struck, as someone who is neither Irish nor Armenian, at how powerful a sense of culture and story and diaspora are. Because, of course, in America, where we live with a small Armenian diaspora, but quite a large Irish diaspora, the notion of culture and story and personhood is often obliterated by the biomedical paradigm that purports a sense of ethics that perhaps has lost what it is we all seek in care. Think about the idea that compassionate care is an oxymoron, right? How can it be care if it lacks compassion? It's really only procedures without compassion. And I think that you'll see in welcoming our next speaker, whom I've just met this morning, that ethics are really about who we are as people. So when I met Patrick just this morning, as Mary introduced us, I was struck by the way in which he faced me and how his warmth and integrity immediately impressed me. Too often, we deal with language and message rather than feeling the emotion and human connection. In just less than 30 seconds, I thought, I like you, Patrick. There's something about you that's truly authentic and genuine that transcends words. And isn't that truly what ethics and its counterpart, morality, is about? So with that, then, what I'd like to do is introduce to you Dr. Patrick Ryan, who's come to us from Limerick, a place I've not been yet, but I am looking forward to someday being there, and perhaps I'll build on learning from you, Patrick. So here we are. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be here. I just need to check something with the technical people first. Do I have to speak at this microphone or can I walk? Will that be okay with regard to recording? Yeah. My reason for asking that is because one of the ways that I use to manage my own anxiety about speaking in public is to move around so that some of my energy gets dissipated in my physical action. So while I'm going to be wired up and hopefully not exploding, take off my jacket in public.
That's all right. The fashion statement speaks for itself, Patrick.
And you know what's just popped into my head? Normally in wintertime, I only iron this third of my shirt because because it's a waste of time ironing the rest of it. But I must have known something in the universe was going to have me take my jacket off before 10:30 in the morning. We're good to go. I can move around. I have to make a comment about the presentation we've just had, because I feel like I've been transported, transformed, and somewhat discombobulated, which I think means I don't really know what I'm at. And that's a wonderful testament to the content and the quality, the sincerity, the integrity of what we've just heard. I'm a Tipperary man, so to try and get my feet back on the ground, there is a part of my brain that actually just wants to sing a song. Possibly something along the first line. Are there people here from Tipperary? Alone, all alone, by the wave-washed strand, all alone in a crowded... Lovely. Okay, we've got you. That has absolutely nothing to do with what I want to speak about. So I've put together about 10 slides. 5 or 6 of those are really just for me, just to keep me on track. Because one of the things that happens is, particularly when I've heard something prior to just speaking that's been really informative and has touched something in me, I get flights of ideas and I go off all over the place. So I'll do a little bit of that because it suits me in particular. But there are 3 or 4 slides towards the end which have a series of questions on them, and I can send that on later on and it can be distributed so that you don't all have to sit and write. Okay. First of all, the title here is quite deliberate. So in terms of some of the words that I've used. When myself and Barry Coughlin wrote our book on aging and mental health issues back in 2011, 2012, it was a bit of a reaction to the common narrative, the common discourse, which is that aging is something that has, by definition, negative connotations, that it's something that isn't to be looked forward to, it can't be enjoyed, it's about things falling off you or things that you don't want attaching themselves to you, and illness and forgetfulness and all of that stuff. We sat and we thought, hold on a minute, this doesn't seem quite fit, not just our stories that we have about people that are older than us that we interact with, but it doesn't seem to fit when we just look around us and see. So part of the ethos that underpinned that book, and it's a scientific academic text, it's weighty, part of what we were trying to do was just to challenge the discourse around this negative vibe that comes when we talk about all of us who are aging. And one of the words that we used regularly through the book was the word elder, because elder is a word that gets taken from, in our minds, it generates this notion of wisdom and stability and a sense of being grounded. And for me, that's really what our elder folk should be doing and do in society. So the word elder is very important in terms of the presentation. The word frail I've used because, again, there's a difficulty with the word frail. When we think of frail and then think of a frail older person, we think of people who are struggling to walk or can't get up the stairs or lose their balance easily. I work in the University of Limerick. We train clinical psychologists, and I head up that training program. My clinical practice, I work predominantly in trauma, and I work predominantly in trauma that's been caused by sexual abuse. And in that, I work with people who have been abused, and I work with people who abuse, and I've always done that, always worked with both side by side. One teaches me about the other really clearly. And I've met people who are 22, 31, 43, 62, 75, 84, 96, who because of trauma experiences in their lives are frail. So we need to get rid of this notion about frailty and elderhood. There are times in all of our lives, if we think of some of our own stories, where we have been really, really frail and our age was irrelevant. So our elders, for me, in terms of this ethical compass, myself and a wonderful young researcher from the Royal College of Physicians, Julie Walsh, a Limerick woman, who's, by the way, an astonishing singer, okay? We've just completed a chapter in a new book that's coming out in February on ethical approaches to using palliative principles for working with older folk. And one of the things that we're proposing is that the place for our older folk in society and how we interact with them as professionals really sets some sort of flag around our values, our core beliefs, our attitudes, our moral standing with regard to how we engage with this group in the population. And one of the things that, as a lecturer and as a researcher, that I've learned over the years is that we need core groups in the population at different times to point us in a direction or to raise a flag about somewhere we're going or somewhere we're not going. So for me, how we engage with our elders tells a lot about how we are as individual professional practitioners and clinicians, but also taps into some of the values and attitudes and beliefs that we allow to run through society in lots of different institutions and different parts of the system that we have in society, be it the church system or the financial system or the political system or whatever it is. Now, compassionate care. I felt I had to use the word compassionate because it's in the title for the conference. But compassion is a very strange word, as is the word passion. Because the roots of it from back in ancient Greek and Latin, I know there are many scholars here in the audience today of ancient Greek and Latin, but actually passion, for those of you who come from a Roman Catholic background, you'll remember from your teaching the passion of our Lord, that's all about suffering. That's nothing to do with being hugely motivated or energized by what's going on around you. I'm passionate about food. What does that actually mean? I suffer because of food? So compassionate means, the passion part is about endurance. And the first part of the word come actually means togetherness. It's that being together. So compassionate means being together with endurance. And that's one of the things that our elder folk can do with us and for us, is that whatever their presenting issue, whatever their condition is, and by that I mean they could be perfectly, happily healthy, and they could be somebody who literally has days to live, they actually bring us together, but there's a condition. And the condition is that we want to engage in that enduring journey, that we want to be together. And this really challenges us as clinicians and practitioners, because when we engage with people who are seen to be unhealthy, unwell, diseased, they become things to us. We objectify them a little bit. Part of that objectification is healthy. It actually allows us to do our work every single day without getting traumatized. But only a part of it is okay. If we objectify people fully, regardless of age, then they simply become things to be done. And that's when we engage in the type of practices where we've got all our rules and regulations, and we make sure that when I'm going off shift at 8 o'clock this evening, if there are 20 boxes on the page that need to be ticked before the night manager comes on, that I've ticked them. How many times did I take temperature? How many times did I do bloods? How many times did I check for clothing to be changed? How many times was there bed rest? All that sort of stuff. When we objectify, we get into measurement. Measurement is partially useful. Psychologists spend most of their life measuring. That's what we do. We are the cause of an awful lot of the measures that you have out and about there. And that comes from the type of psychology that we practice, particularly in developed worlds, where we see people's emotions and thinking and behavior as being quantifiable. We can put our finger on it and go, Patrick Ryan is like that because he's got 3 of this, 4 of that, 5 of the other. He's not like this because he is none of that or too much of the other. And a lot of our interaction with any part of the population that is in some way distressed or diseased, we deem it as being successful if we can move the measures up and down. It's a bit like a knob or a volume button on your radio. We just do that and it's okay, and we do that and it's not okay. And if only it was that easy. So working with our elder folk really should cause us to stop a lot and question, what am I at? Why am I at it? And why am I not doing something else? Who am I doing it with? Who am I doing it for? How am I doing it? Could I do it worse? Could I do it better? How am I asking and looking for help to allow me to do it differently? This is some of you may find this story funny, so if you do, feel free to laugh, and for others, don't laugh. About 6 years ago or so, I was standing in the room in my parents' house, just outside Nina, and I went to go into the room because my granny was in there, and I heard a whole pile of chatter. And the chatter was coming from 2 different groups of kids, grandchildren. They were actually her great-grandchildren. There was one group who were about, at the time, they were about 8, 9, 10, and the other group were about 3 and 4. Probably about 6, 7 kids in the room with her. And the group that were chattering the loudest were the older group, and it was all about, no, do her hair like this. She doesn't like blue eyeshadow. She does. And there was this back and forth. She does, she doesn't, she does, she doesn't. And the other kids, the smaller ones who were obviously sitting on the floor, were trying to, it seems to be from standing outside, climb on the bed. And going, I can't get up. And then you heard a thump, and somebody had obviously tried to climb up the sheet and fallen down. This was fantastic This was a woman who was 103 years of age, bringing together her great-grandchildren to get them talking about her makeup and her hair and what she liked and didn't like dresses, but she does like skirts. And the other group who just wanted to get up and see what was going on and fallen off because the bed sheets were so high, that were too high for them to get up on top of. It was my granny's wake. She'd passed away a couple of days earlier. And I stood at the door and I just thought this was absolutely wonderful. It was really, really funny. It was really touching. And it was a massive lesson for me about the power of people to teach beyond. And I've just learned something this morning. It's about the social death concept. This woman, my granny, was alive. She was teaching. Her body was dead, died 2 days earlier. She was teaching. And she was triggering this response in her great-grandchildren, some of whom wanted to clatter up and see what was going on, and the older ones who wanted to do her makeup so that, because we had said to them that she'll be put into the coffin in a couple of days' time and we'll take her from the house and up to the church. And they wanted to make sure that she looked really, really well, because Granny Coughlin always looked well. She died on the 6th of September, and 2 weeks previously had bought 4 pairs of new shoes when she was in Spanish Point in West Clare on her holidays, where she was there for, I think, a month in the mobile home with my mum. So the point in this, and in recounting that story to you, is that we live in a society where we can worry ourselves that all is change and all is horrible, and if only it was like the old ways and old days. But we have a group of people who not alone wore the T-shirt, but actually probably designed the T-shirt as well, who can teach us how to handle this stuff. They teach all the time. Not in the way that a teacher stands in front of you at a class or a speaker stands in front of you at a conference, but by being. But a teacher is only 50% of the equation. So it comes back then to me, it comes back to us as professionals, as clinicians. It's how do I approach the teacher as a learner, as a student? What am I open to learning? And in being open to learning, am I prepared to be troubled? Because when we learn things that we sort of half know already, it's nice, it's comfortable, it's a bit like a warm room, it feels nice. But really, for true learning to happen, we need to have our scripts, our ideas, our values, our beliefs, our moral code, our ethical code. We need to have them shaken up every so often. And older folk can do that really, really well. And they can do it really well because they've got a lifetime of history which they can share with us, so they can challenge us through that verbal cognitive process. But actually, the vast bulk of our learning never happens through verbal, cognitive, talking type of interactions. The vast bulk of our learning happens in the microseconds when we engage with each other and we make hugely quick decisions about what's going on between us. And I'm a scientist practitioner. I like measures to some degree. But the world of neuroscience is opening up to us all sorts of possibilities around what happens when we engage with people and what happens in how we engage with people. One of the things that I teach the students on the course in Limerick is that as psychologists, we should rarely talk to the clients that we work with. And that seems very strange because in the common narrative, psychologists are people who talk all the time and they'll help you. If you talk to them, they will help you. Just take this for a moment. Can you imagine a time in your life maybe when you were very distressed, possibly maybe very depressed, very, very sad, struggling in a dark place, the dark shadow, the black shadow place? The one thing you don't want to do when you're in that place is talk about it. You don't. And there's a really good reason why you don't want to talk about it, Because when we talk about particularly emotions that are more negative, what do you think happens? We feel them more intensely. So when I'm depressed, if you make me talk about it, I will feel more depressed. If I've got anger issues, we've got wonderful research that shows us, if I've got anger issues and I'm very angry all the time and you get me to talk about my anger, I'll be a lot more angry by the end of that conversation. So as a psychologist, one of the things that we need to be aware of is that talking is a tool that we use deliberately and in a very considered way at a time that has optimum value and use for the person that we're going to engage with. Older folk are brilliant at reading the cues as to when and when not to talk. Because they've been around for so long, they've made the mistake 100 times, they've practiced it, and they also know that the best communication isn't in words, even though sometimes it feels like it is. The best communication is in what we do with these two things here. Think of a moment when you've been with, you might have had a really bad infection or a worry about your own health, and you've gone to a GP, where you felt that the GP really got you. And if we were to record that moment where you come out after your 3.5 minutes in with the GP, as we get in Ireland, because the GPs are so amazing, they can sort it all out like that. If we had you recorded, what would happen in that moment between you and the GP where you felt that the GP got you? Is that the GP would have looked at you in a very certain way and you would have looked back, and the GP would have looked at you as if the GP was carrying you on in his or her left arm, having a reaction, an interaction just like this, eye to eye, eye to eye. Why do you think that was so powerful? What does that mirror and mimic, do you imagine? You're right, you have it. It's how we interact with young infants, newborns in particular. Newborns do something powerful to us. They force us to do this to them. And there's a really good reason that we now understand that we didn't understand 10 years ago and 15 years ago. It's got to do with how the different parts of the brain interact with each other and cross each other and communicate with each other. Newborns, by and large, will force us into this interaction. Caregivers and care seekers who interact with each other, when the interaction is deemed to be positive by both, repeat this. Older folk, by and large, who are not distressed and not diseased, get us to interact like this also. There's a connection, and it's to do with, there's a debate in neuroscience around the left brain and the right brain, the logical brain and the creative brain. And this is all the new thing, and everybody's very, very excited about it. And then because I'm the oldest of 3 boys brought up in a very traditional Irish family, and I went to college and I got lots of letters and titles and stuff, golden boy and all of that. So as a way of balancing that, I do a lot of things where I break rules and act out, usually healthily and legally, just to sort of shake it up a little bit. And I've lost my train of thought in telling you that particular story. Thank you. Left brain and right brain. So there's a debate, left brain, right brain, logical and creative. And of course, to me, that's a complete nonsense, because no parts of our body ever work in isolation. They're not divorced from each other. If Mary was to literally lift her knee right now, really quickly and hard, there'll be reactions in a number of places, starting up here, going the whole way through. We can't disconnect different bits of our body. So this notion of left brain and right brain and all of that is a nonsense. And older folk know it, because what they do is they very carefully take stock of and they judge how to interact with somebody. And they do that when they're giving care, but they do it equally when they're seeking care. This is the tapping experience we heard about earlier from Dana. Clinicians, those of us who are involved in professional caregiving, we need to learn from the instruction and direction that are given by the older people that we work with around their communication preferences. And we also need to know, how do we respond when somebody seeks care from us? Because if our response is, what did I learn in chapter 3 of some book that I read when I was in college, then we're going nowhere. Chapter 3 of that book gives you a framework and a guidance procedure to hopefully act ethically and responsibly. But it doesn't tell you how to communicate effectively in a way that's nurturing and connected, and we heard the term earlier, healing. And healing not in the sense of the wound is clear and free of infection, but healing in terms of the person who's seeking care feeling that at the very minimum they've been listened to and their request has been heard. Not that the request has been fulfilled, because at any point in our lives we might want something, but one of the things that we learn is that it may not be possible to provide it. That's part of the maturation process and development through our lives. So a core question for us is, how do I respond, how do I communicate to the people that I care for, particularly if they're in a state of distress, physical distress or mental distress? How do I communicate that in some way allows that person to feel still human and not objectified by measures? How do I make the determination that their experience of quality care is actually something that's of value to them? So a question becomes, how often do we stop and go, how are you doing here, now, with me? How are you doing when the shifts change and Jack comes on or Barbara comes on? How do you do when your grandchildren come in or not come in? How often do we ask that question? And you know that wonderful Irish way of asking, how are you? It's like, well, how's it going? How are you? I mean, the last thing that we ever want to hear in answer to that question is the answer, right? You don't want to hear how I am at all. And you know what happens to us when somebody starts into their story about telling you how they are? There's that bit of heart sink, or your tummy flips, or you're thinking, oh, I've only got 10 minutes left on the car parking ticket, so I need to get back out. But when we're working with older folk where the pace is different, if we want to hold dignity and respect for them and for ourselves as professionals, we need to ask about the quality of their experience. And we need to be very careful about assuming that we know that just because somebody's bed was made this morning, just because there's water in the glass or the window is open or there's a fresh bunch of flowers, that that's enough or that it's okay. People have different likes and dislikes. The smell of flowers to some is beautiful. The smell of flowers to others just reminds them of another dying thing. One of in the chapter of the book that's coming out in February, we've taken principles from palliative care and written about their application to working with frail elderly. And the principles of palliative care, end-of-life care, which have come from the hospice movement and cancer care, are really captured like this. First, it is about symptom control and managing pain. But if you look at the next set of them, they're about that interpersonal connectivity experience. So how do we go about our business of assessment and diagnosis? How do we design intervention packages? How do we tailor those? How do we change them? How do we ensure that somebody in the system knows whether I'm a religious person or not, or whether I'm spiritual or not. And what does spirituality mean to me? So in Ireland, for an awful long time, spirituality meant a certain religion, certain church attendance, etc., etc. But for many people in Ireland and other countries, we know that spirituality relates back to that very old mystical connection with nature. That's in all of our old Irish legends, that connection to nature. Would we feel comfortable at a multidisciplinary team with psychologists and consultants and social care workers and nurses and the whole pot and caboodle actually talking about somebody's desire to walk amongst the trees, and that may be far more important than whether they got blood pressure medication at exactly 11:53? Okay? So I'm not dismissing anything. What I'm doing is opening up a challenge around how we think and how we assume that certain things are being done or not being done. So in terms of palliation, one of the reasons that myself and Julie Lynch adopted this was because in palliation, the key fundamental is around the relationship and the relating variable. How do I relate to the person that I'm caring for? What's my part in the system that cares for the individual? How does the system care or not care? And this is something that we've got to be very careful with. One of the things that happens in a lot of developed healthcare systems is there's huge emphasis placed on the education and training of professionals. And in some way, that at some point transitions into then becoming expert. And we've got this obsession with being expert and what that means. And again, there's a place for expertise every so often. So as a professional, if you ever had the misfortune to be called into a court case to be an expert witness, the court depends on your knowledge, which is different from that of the person on the street about a particular condition. That's useful. You're there to give the most up-to-date information as best you can. But in terms of our everyday interactions with clients or with patients, being an expert normally blocks the communication channels that are most useful. And I'm not dismissing your education or your qualifications or the fact that you might be an expert in your area. What I'm saying is that just like talk, expertise is a tool that you choose to use deliberately at a certain point with a certain person because it's the best tool available. If you use it all the time, it's a bit like the strict parent at home. If you're strict all the time, your child will end up throwing something at you. If you're strict when the child needs it, there'll be a lesson learned. So the relationship variable is extremely important. Tuning into how people make sense of themselves and their world. And this piece is important because if you're going to assist people to make sense of their own story, their own condition, their health or their lack of health, you need to understand something about your own story. Because otherwise you'll end up a little bit like, there was a word that Michael used earlier with me around this vocational professional. In the past, everybody who worked in healthcare had some sort of vocation. Apart from being a medic or a doctor, they never seemed to be allowed that, which I always found really strange. But nurses were all vocationalists. That was your vocation. So because it was your vocation, then we won't pay you properly and we won't give you leave properly and all that sort of stuff because it's your vocation. What was all that about? Making sense of how we do our own work is important. Why do I do this job? Oh, I do it because I was quite interested in helping older people. Why? Because, my mother was a great carer. Maybe that was the story. I do it because I'm obsessed with money and this is the best paid job in the world. I do it because I like performing in front of people and there's a group here this morning and you're all captured and you can't go anywhere for 40 minutes. So that'll do me until I go to Dublin this afternoon and talk again, right? I do it because I really value the contribution that each person in society brings to the table. And I want to sustain that, because at some point I will be that person, and I will want somebody who's a little bit younger or a little bit more able to look after me in a certain way. Maybe you've got that higher order functioning. But the point here is that if we want to tune in to the needs of others, we must know a little bit of our own needs first of all and have made sense of those. In palliation, one of the things that we do, one of the demands, is to try and help people express themselves. And again, our first thing is, well, we'll get them to talk. We'll get them to say how they are, how you doing, whatever. It doesn't really work that much. Sometimes it does. But expression can be as simple as they want to put their hand on my hand. Not because they think my hand is particularly nice, but they just want to feel the warmth of body contact, because touch is such a primal thing that we do. This is really important for us because we live in a time where all of a sudden over the last few weeks we've learnt really, really in our face that touch can be absolutely such a destructive tool. And when we get into hierarchies and power positions, touch is one of the things that can be used to destroy people's lives by keeping them down and keeping them quiet and keeping them silenced. And there's something happening now that's going to break that. But what do we do with touch in our care homes? What do we do with touch in our hospitals when there's an older person who's quite frail, quite uneasy about going into a particular clinic? Where do we engage in something that we know from our neuroscience research can really quickly soothe out and smooth out anxiety feelings? Touch is one of the basic tools that we have. But is touch taboo in the nursing home that I work in? Is touch taboo in the ward that I walk around in? If I was to place my hand on the arm of an elderly, frail person, how would that be seen? One of the things about working with frail elderly is that we will come into contact with a lot of people who care for them. They're significant others. In that group, we also come into contact with people who don't care about them because there's been some bad history. That's a part of our story. None of us go through life smelling the roses all the time. We're not all born into families where everything was aplenty and there was never any difficulty. So the expectation that we carry sometimes, oh, look, he's old, she's old, she needs a little bit of this and a little bit of that. We need to take into account and hold in our heads that there may be another half of this relationship with a child in the family or a brother or a cousin or an uncle that's actually full of trauma and distress. So when you say to them, look, she could do with a little bit more visits because she seems to enjoy visits from people, that may not be something that can come the other way. That's a piece of information that you need to make sense of so that you can bring that to a multidisciplinary team or a care group meeting about somebody and say, well, actually, more visits from this uncle, that cousin, that sister, isn't that useful because here's what I've seen when they're together. It's a little bit frosty. It's a little bit staid. Or afterwards, he's very agitated for a couple of hours, or she's very agitated. So the palliation principles are ones that we feel strongly can be used in terms of working with people who are distressed, where their mental health has been thrown out of equilibrium. Is there somebody keeping the time? Because there is. Super. Because I would go on and go on. My granny used to say that when I got a job in the University of Limerick in 2005, she thought that was very funny. She couldn't believe that somebody would pay me to talk in front of groups of people. She goes, you just do that anyway. She had a line that I think she borrowed from Brendan Grace about, he used to go downstairs in the middle of the night to rob something out of the fridge, but as soon as they opened the fridge door and the lights came on, he started talking, so he was always found out. Okay, so we need to do three things that you should take away from here, at least, I think. One is to think about the frail older person in the context of their life. Where are they and where are they now? And one of the places that you'll interact with our frail elders is in service provision. So it's that big system piece. It could be in a hospital. It could be in a care home. It might be at home where care comes in and comes out. And there are a series of questions that you need to think about if you want to consider yourself an ethical practitioner. And remember that ethical frameworks and ethical practice is not about having answers. The reason we have ethical frameworks is because there are dilemmas we come across for which there are either no answers or there are 1,000, and all of them are as good or as bad as each other. Ethical frameworks are there to ensure that we don't do something that is purposefully and deliberately destructive. Sometimes we make ethical decisions that cause harm. The reason we do that is because if we didn't make the decision, the harm that would be caused would be even greater. So ethical practice is not about clean slate, all boxes ticked. Ethical practice is about swimming your way through very mucky, muddy water and arriving at decisions that allow you to make the best choice possible at this time. So your service, that your interaction, you need to take back questions, that ask questions around what's in place to ensure that the person has been respected. When we say we offer quality care, how do we do that? What are the things that I could put my finger on if an inspector walked in? And then what are the things that we don't do? And we don't do it because we don't have enough staff or because we don't have that particular expertise at a particular moment in the service's time. How do we communicate to people who are frail if their treatment is going to change? How is that decision communicated to them in a way that they can at least know there's conversations happening about them if they can't be part of it? How do we bring in advocates? One of the things we do in the department that I head up in UL is we meet every month to discuss various policies and procedures, and it's normally around things like students copying each other's work or trying to cheat in exams and all that sort of stuff that's been going on for centuries and centuries, and we think it's the worst ever now. One of the things that we're doing is whenever, as a head of department, there's about 28 staff or so. When we're sitting around a table, if I make a proposal, this is what we're going to do to sort this problem. If everybody in that room says to me, yeah, that's a really good idea, we scrap that proposal. We always need a challenging voice. There always needs to be the grumpy customer, the person who says, that's not going to work. That's too much this, it's too little that. Why would we do that way, not the other way? It's really important when we're talking about people who may not have full voice to express their own needs. It's really important that we've got somebody who'll advocate on their behalf. Not because by advocating they're right or they're better than us, but their questioning or their opposition or their challenge causes us to think about, why did I think that was a good idea? And, here's why. 3 good reasons why I thought it was a good idea. Actually, it's a good idea. Or, I never saw it from that angle. I never thought that cut flowers might represent death to somebody who's dying. Never thought of that at all. What I'll do is, I'll go and check. So having an advocate, having somebody who'll voice the opposition, somebody who'll row against the common voice, that will generally ensure that you're on very good ethical principles and foundations for making your decisions. So that's the service need. But we have individual responsibility as well. I am responsible as a professional caregiver to do certain things. And how do I take time out to consider whether I'm up to date on my training or my education or my reading? How do I take time out to go, you know what, I'm in a really bad mood today. If somebody says something to me, I'm going to eat the head off them. I think I would be far better scrubbing out the toilets than involved in direct patient care today. That would be a better use of my time, because otherwise I could do something that is very, very disrespectful and unprofessional. How do I know that the people that are connected and related to the person that I'm looking after, that they're part of whatever conversations and discourses that are going on? How do I know it? Do I just fall into, well, it's policy number 3 and page 27, paragraph 2, tick box, but actually what's the experience? If that older person got me eye to eye like this, could I hold the gaze and go, I know you've been cared for because X, Y, Z? How do I make those judgments? How do I make those decisions? And the piece at the bottom is about understanding our own story as caregivers. Generally, caregivers give care because they had a poor experience of it of themselves in the past. That's why we're caregivers. It's also one of the reasons why we're good caregivers. We've a little bit of a knack for doing it. We don't get bowled over by the trauma of somebody being very unwell or of somebody dying. We don't collapse in a heap. When I'm teaching with the students in the paramedics program in UL, one of the things I say to them, which they're horrified by, is that they've got some personality traits in common with psychopaths. So if we gave them a psychological test on psychopathy, they'd score on some of them. They're all horrified. And then I say, well, here's an example. Imagine as a paramedic, if you're a first responder in the ambulance and you come across a horrific road accident where there are a lot of casualties, the last thing the people who are injured want is you getting out of the ambulance and crumbling in a heap. Just like any of you who have ever minded young children, be it as parents or aunts or uncles or whatever, when a 4-year-old falls off a bike and scratches elbows and arms and knees, the last thing they need is you going, oh my God, that's horrendous and awful, fall in tears, I don't know what to do. They don't need that. That'll frighten the life out of them. And the fear that they're already feeling, you will multiply it. What do we do with the 4-year-old who falls off the bike and has the cut knees and the cut arms? We take them up and we go, it's okay. It's all right. Come on, we'll get a bit of cream. Cream doesn't want to do anything. We'll give it a bit of a wash. The wash-up is going to cause more tears. But we hold them. And in that holding, we just let all those anxiety levels sit back down. So, who can assist me in ensuring that I can practice with as much professionalism or care, love, and soul to ensure that I can always hold this gaze with the person that's looking at me, or that I can catch their breath so that if I frighten them, I notice the chest rise. There's something has happened. They're not comfortable with me, and it might be today, and it might be generally. How do I read the signals that always come our way? Always. I'm nearly there. I'm going the wrong way. I've made all these points. Frail elders guide us towards good, personable, honest, professional, ethical practice. They'll show us the way to do it. They'll raise a flag if we're not doing it okay or in a way that's uncomfortable, that should make us question, what am I doing? What is my service doing? Key to many locks. Compassion means togetherness in enduring something. Frail elders are exemplars to us that no matter what point in time in society and history that we live, when the whole thing seems mad, actually you can endure. And we have. There have always been wars and famines and strife and trouble. My 103-year-old granny, World War I, World War II, Easter Rising, War of Independence, all of that. Recessions, oh, she'd write the book on recessions. Frail elderly challenge our views about not just the elderly, but about life itself. And they challenge it not because they've got a whole pile of answers. They challenge it because they simply can pose the question. Why this? Why not the other? How this? How not the other? Is there an alternative? Have you considered it? Have you not been able to consider it because you're too rushed, too stressed? And they are the custodians of our care-seeking and care-giving narratives. And that's very important for those of us who are engaged professionally. They can teach us how we give care, and they can teach us how we do, or for most of us, how we don't look for care ourselves, because we're too busy saving the world, because that's what brought us into caring in the first place. You can't care for others in a way that allows you to do that two-on-two gaze unless you first of all engage in caring for yourself. I appreciate all the attention. Thank you very much.
That was remarkable. Did you feel the harmony between Dana and Patrick's messages to you, whether it's gaze or the importance of the question, not the answer? Particularly as we consider the idea that, as Patrick has shared with us, we can all be frail at any age, and as care providers, we often make ourselves more frail. Rather than reaching out and seeking help. So with that in mind, we have half an hour. We're coming back together at 11:30. So I encourage you to take this time. Tea and coffee are that way. Toilets are that way, and of course the Rock of Cashel, where you can walk up and spend a moment in its energy instead of tea or coffee, is of course above us. So thank you all, and we'll see you back here at 11.